Hey Team Bio, welcome to your screencast on symbiotic relationships. So in biology class or in science, we define symbiotic relationships as close ecological relationships between two or more organisms. I'm going to write that down. Close ecological relationships between two or more organisms. And when I say close ecologically, I mean physically close to one another. So the relationships that the symbiotic relationships that we're gonna examine today happen in close proximity to one another. Okay. There are three broad categories of symbiotic relationships. They're all symbiotic relationships, and they all have different advantages or disadvantages between the partners engaged within these relationships. The first category of a symbiotic relationship is called mutualism. And mutualism is a type of symbiotic relationship where both participants in the relationship benefit. So we're going to put two pluses here because in a mutualistic relationship, there are two parties and they're both benefiting. Okay, in our first example of a mutualistic symbiotic relationship is a plant and pollinator relationship. So here we have a plant, and here we have a pollinator. In this close mutualistic relationship, both the pollinator and the plant are benefiting from this interaction. The plant, or actually let's talk about the pollinator first. The pollinator is getting a free meal in the form of nectar or simple sugars. So this is a positive thing for the pollinator. It's coming around, it's collecting simple sugars in the form of nectar or maybe pollen, so simple sugars or protein if it's collecting pollen. And so it's getting a free meal. But I guess there's no such thing as free lunch. The plant is also getting something out of this relationship. What the pollinator might be unaware of is that as it goes from flower to flower to flower to flower, it is delivering pollen from one flower to the next flower. Pollen is similar to sperm in that it is one of the reproductive gametes, sex cells of the plant. And so the plant is getting sex from this interaction. Pollen delivery from one flower to the next. Okay, so both parties are benefiting. Pollinator, free lunch, plant gets sex. Okay, our next example of a mutualistic relationship are termites, which we have been examining in class. So here's an example of a termite. And a little microorganism living inside of the termite's gut, which is called trichonympha. It's spelled TrichonymphA. I didn't give myself quite enough space there. Trichonympha. Okay, not going to move that around because it's moving the whole picture. Trichonympha is a small single-celled protist living in the gut of this termite. And termites, as you might have heard, they digest wood in order to that's what they eat, wood. But wood is primarily made up of a compound of glucose called cellulose. And termites don't have the proteins that break down cellulose into its simplest form of sugar, glucose. They rely on the trichonympha living within their gut to break down the cellulose for them into glucose. So this is a close mutualistic relationship between the termite and the trichonympha, because the termite is supplying the trichonympha dinner. So out of this, the trichonympha gets a meal, which is cellulose in its complex form, and then the trichonympha breaks down that cellulose into glucose monomers. So it's breaking down a complex sugar into a simple sugar, and the trichonympha eats some of that glucose, and then the termite also eats some of that glucose. So it also gets a meal out of the deal. So these two could not live one without the other. The termite couldn't break down its cellulose into glucose, and the trichonympha, without the presence of the termite giving it a home and feeding it, would also be at a disadvantage here. So they're both getting fed from this interaction. Okay, our next form of symbiotic relationships is parasitism. And parasitism is one species benefits from the relationship, and the other species has a negative interaction or negative impact on it as a result of this relationship. Okay, our first example of parasitism is ticks. Here's a tick. This, not chit, T-I-C-K, not titch, tick. This tick is totally engorged because it is full of blood from a blood meal from a human. So this is a positive interaction for the tick because it's getting a meal in the form of blood. But it's a negative interaction for the human because it's losing nutrients to the tick a bit, just a very small amount of blood. But ticks are also carrying diseases. We looked at a picture the other day in class of a spirochete, and that spirochete, there are many different types of spirochete diseases, but we specifically looked at Lyme disease. While tick is having the positive benefit of a blood meal, the human is potentially contracting a disease. So not so great for the human. Another example of parasitism is this image here of an oak tree gall. So this is an oak tree. A leaf of an oak. And this is a structure called a gall, G-A-L-L. And inside of this gall, if we were to open it up, we would find the larvae of a type of wasp called a non-stinging wasp. So the gall structure is actually oak leaf tissue. The non-stinging wasp, when it is a larvae, comes to an oak tree, attaches itself to a leaf, and it secretes a hormone. And that hormone actually manipulates the oak leaf cells and induces them to grow and form this structure, a gall. So this gall tissue is actually composed of the yolk, and the non-stinging wasp is inside, maturing. So it's a negative interaction for the yolk because it's using its resources to build this home, this structure for the non-stinging wasp to mature inside of. But it's a positive interaction for the wasp because now it has a place to grow up. So these are pretty cool. If you're wandering around the woods these days, you can find them on the forest floor. There's a bunch of different types of non-stinging wasps, and they grow galls on different types of trees. You can also see these on goldenrod currently, but they usually form on the stems of goldenrods. Okay, so parasitism is a positive interaction for one, a negative interaction for the other. Our last form of symbiotic relationships it's called commensalism. And commensalism is when you have a positive interaction for one organism, and then the other organism in the relationship is unaffected. So I'm going to write NA here, not applicable. The relationship doesn't really affect them at all. Our first example of commensalism is a zebra and a cattle egret. The way that this relationship works is that the zebra is living its life on the savanna, out minding its business, eating the grass. And as it's wandering around the savanna, it is kicking up dust and dirt and also tiny little bugs. And so the cattle egret follows the zebra around and eats the little bugs that are driven out of the grasses as the zebra grazes. So it's the zebra's totally unaffected by this relationship, whereas the cattle egret is benefiting from the zebra scaring up small insects for it to consume. Okay, our second example of commensalism is an example of a humpback whale and barnacles. So here's our whale. And so the whale is doing its thing, living its life, moving around the ocean, filter feeding on plankton, and the barnacles are attached to the whale, on for the free ride, and as they move around with the whale, they are filter feeding the ocean water. So the whale is unaffected by the barnacles, but the barnacles are positively impacted because they get a free ride around the ocean, and they filter feed wherever the whale goes. There are some people that would argue that commensalistic relationships are, if you were to examine them really closely, you would actually see that they're not truly, one organism isn't truly unaffected, that they're examples of mild parasitism and mild mutualism. For example, the cattle egret and the zebra, we might say that the zebra is unaffected, but you could also say that the cattle egret is maybe eating bugs that would otherwise be biting the zebra. So maybe this is a slight positive relationship for the zebra. So maybe this commensalistic relationship is actually mutualism in disguise. Or the whale versus barnacle situation, maybe this is a mild form of parasitism because these barnacles, they add up, they're heavy, and the whale has to be carrying them around. So it's a slight extra drain of energy for the whale. So all that is to say is that commensalistic relationships, we're not quite sure if these are a true category. We might be able to say that there's never someone who's truly unaffected in a symbiotic relationship, that we can boil all things down to parasitism and mutualism. But it doesn't exist as a category, and I'd like you to know it. Okay, Other interspecific interactions that we're going to be studying this year that you've definitely heard of. Interspecific means between different species. Categories that you've definitely heard of. Predation. A predator-prey relationship is positive for, oops, I forgot the O in there. Predation. Oops. Predation is good for one, the predator, bad for the other, the prey. Herbivory is maybe kind of like predation, but with things that are eating producers. So an example of herbivory would be cow eating the grass. It is good for the cow, not as good for the grass. And then competition is when you have two different species competing for limited resources. If you have a bird feeder, you might notice that there are many different types of birds that are all eating the black oil sunflower seeds. This is an example of competition. And competition across different species is usually bad for both of them. They're both competing for same limited resources. So they're both negatively affected by competition. Okay, that is all for the screencast. I will see you in class next week.